Hi, everybody. It's good to have you here. I'm Kathy Scoggin, and I'm the co-director for the Washington State Sensory Disability Services. And this time I get to listen just like you do, so I'm looking forward to this. I've asked Flint Simonsen to come in and talk about the issue of what people consider problem behavior. And sometimes it's something other than problem behavior, and it could be communication, it could be many other things that are going on. And this is in part an introduction for those of us who are working with students who've been identified with, quote, a behavior problem. So without too much ado, I'd like to introduce you to Flint Simonsen. He is a professor at Eastern Washington University. And he is also doing private consulting across the state of Washington with school districts. So I'm going to let Flint tell you a little bit about his background so you know where he's speaking from too. We've been excited. I got a chance to meet Flint at Eastern and spoke to some of his classes. And one of the things that I found exciting was bringing somebody in who may not have known very much about kids with sensory disabilities, but had a real affinity to listening to people about sensory disabilities and starting to respond in ways to us that was helpful to our students with sensory disabilities. So with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Flint. Flint, welcome.
Thank you, Kathy. It is good to be with you. I do want to share a little bit of background about myself, and that might help to understand how it is that I come here today to talk about this topic. I did my undergraduate studies at Eastern Washington University some number of years ago in developmental psychology. I have a master's degree in something called applied behavior analysis from Northeastern University in Boston. And while I was out on the East Coast, I was a teacher and a supervisor of teachers at a place called the New England Center for Children, which is a residential school for kids with significant disabilities. So if you imagine the most severely disabled child you've ever seen or worked with, and then move 5 or 6 steps more towards severe, that was the population that we worked with. Many of the kids that came to the center were there not just because of intellectual disabilities, but they were there because of some significant challenging behaviors. In fact, in much of public education, it's the behavioral challenges that lead to more restrictive kinds of placements. So that was the place that I learned that I like kids who behave badly. I think they're the most creative kids on the planet. And I know that if their creativity happens to be directed towards you, you're not nearly as impressed. But it is true that I've greatly enjoyed working with that particular group of students over the years. I came back to the West Coast and did my PhD at the University of Oregon. Go Ducks. I'm a proud Duck. And then I came full circle and have been teaching in our teacher preparation program at Eastern Washington University for about a decade. Over the last couple of years, I've taken a leave of absence from the university, so I haven't been teaching classes on campus, just to work with kids and schools and parents and families, mostly around the issue of behavioral challenges. So I have a private consulting business called Mosaic Cooperative and have thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to be out in public schools working directly with kids. So that's like the little short version of who I am. I also have enjoyed my time working with Washington Sensory Disability Services around the state of Washington. It's been a learning experience for me, understanding issues around sensory disabilities, but also seeing the connection between some of the communication challenges and difficulties for that particular group of students and the ways in which there's a relationship to those things that many people consider to be problem behaviors or challenging behaviors. And Kathy asked me if I would talk today a little bit about that topic. So when is it that a problem behavior is something other than a problem behavior? And I might actually add or suggest that one of the secrets to understanding or working with challenging behaviors is recognizing that a problem behavior is not a problem for the students or children who engage in those problems. They really are functional skills. So, the context of thinking about a challenging behavior as something that's bad and needs to be changed, while it might be a problem for the adults or other individuals who experience it, from the perspective of the child who's engaged in that behavior, they're doing it for a reason. And I want to spend some time today talking a little bit about some of those reasons, understanding maybe some assumptions that we bring when we look at a behavior we're concerned about, and then describing some strategies for thinking through, well, what do we do? I'm not suggesting we should simply tolerate behaviors that might be challenging or difficult. The difference here, though, is understanding that how we approach that behavior may or may not lead to effectively changing that behavior. So that's kind of the context that we're going to cover today. I have a few objectives in that vein. I want to make sure that we have some common language or understanding about what a challenging behavior or problem behavior even is. And then we're going to look at some issues or considerations, some things to think about, and again, especially for kids who might have communication issues or students who might have a disability. What are some of the other issues before we simply assume that this is some kind of naughty behavior that we need to change? I want you to understand the importance of the context in which behaviors occur as a way to filter or make decisions about what to do next. And then we'll use a framework then for making decisions about addressing specific behaviors that you might actually be concerned about. So let's start with some basics. When we talk about behavior, even that word itself is something that usually has a negative connotation. When we say a kid is behaving inappropriately, or even if we use it the other way around and say, I want you to behave, what we mean usually is that I'm interested in seeing something acceptable from you, something that I deem appropriate. And if you're not, then we would talk about that as being a problem behavior. Before I address that issue, I think I want to describe a common language that for me is important before we start interpreting what a behavior is or why a kid would act that way. I want to use some language here to talk about what is it that I mean when I use that term throughout the rest of the training today. I would offer a simple definition that behavior is really any observable movement or action. It's things that we do. It's physical. It might be talking. It might be vocalizations. It might be moving arms and legs. At its most basic level, behavior is simply that. It's those actions that we could observe, recognize, or see somebody doing. And the way that you know if you're describing a behavior is by looking at whether that behavior is available to one of our five senses. So can you see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, or smell it? And if you can, it's probably a behavior. Now, even within that, I think it's really important to be very specific or concrete about what we're trying to describe. I hear a lot of teachers, for example, that will say, well, the student is disruptive. And that's fine. I've seen kids who are disruptive, but that doesn't give me enough information to know what I'm looking at or looking for, because what that one student does, the specific actions that that one student does, which the teacher calls disruptive, may be very different from other kids who get the similar label of being disruptive or displaying disruptive actions or behaviors. So if you can see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, or smell it, it's probably a behavior. And yes, it's true, some behaviors you can smell. I'm not going to go any further than that. But as you think about what you're concerned about, that's one level of having some clarity. What is it specifically that I'm interested in changing, or what is it specifically that I'm concerned about? We have to first understand that before we can start to interpret. Even by using the label saying that that's naughty behavior, that's inappropriate behavior, we're assigning some kind of motive to that. And so in the sequence, we want to first describe or define what the behavior is, and then we can start trying to interpret. And then we can start trying to understand what's going on. And one of the common things I've seen is that when a child breaks a rule, when a child does something that they're not supposed to do, there is a tendency for us to assume some kind of intentional or malicious motives, that they're being willfully disobedient, or they did that on purpose, or they're trying to frustrate, or they're trying to break the rules. And that might be true in some cases. There really are two types of problem behaviors. There are can't-do problems, and there are won't-do problems. A can't-do problem I would describe as a lack of skill, and a won't-do problem I would describe as a lack of will. The latter is what most people mean when they say this kid is being willfully disobedient. They know what they're supposed to do, but they're breaking the rule. And this also is an important distinction because, again, if we assume that a child is willfully defying directions or is intentionally breaking a rule, then that leads us to particular actions or consequences. Usually it leads to trying to be punitive or punishing. Teach a kid a lesson, don't do that again. If, however, a child doesn't have the skills, if they might not be fluent at staying in bounds or doing what they're supposed to do, then no amount of punishment will teach them how to act instead. So I would encourage that we start out by being really clear about what our interpretations are, but maybe even giving a child the benefit of the doubt and ruling out other explanations for behavior first. We might come back to this willful disobedience. We might come back to won't do as an explanation for why a child's acting out, but it's first to consider the possibility that maybe there are other things that are going on for that particular student. There's another related issue here. We have a tendency to consider, when we're looking at motives for behavior, to consider things that are going on inside of a person. We all have our own internal world. We all have our own thoughts and feelings. The problem with those thoughts and feelings is that we can only know someone else's thoughts or feelings based on what they give us or what they show us or what they share with us. In other words, it's those actions, those overt behaviors that are the way we try to interpret what's going on inside of a person. A simple example of this is when we see a person that we think is sad or we think is angry, it's often the nonverbals that they display that we infer as a feeling or an emotion that they must be experiencing inside of themselves. So they may furrow up their brow, they may huff, they may sigh, they may bang their fist on the table. And from that pattern of behavior, we imply that there's something going on inside of them. And you might be right. It could be that a child is angry. But the caution that I want to advise here is that we are making an inference that they're feeling something that they may or may not be feeling. It's possible that we may misinterpret their actions, both their verbal and their nonverbal behaviors, as being something that it really isn't. Well, let me take it to a different level. I know in my own life with other adults, there have been times where I have honestly misinterpreted what somebody else was thinking or feeling because I was implying or inferring something that I thought was happening that really wasn't. So it can lead to relationship and communication errors or mistakes or misunderstandings when we pay too much importance on what those overt behaviors mean about what's going on inside. And I'm actually not sure if we even knew, if we could even know what's going on inside. if that would be a useful tool to change those internal thoughts, feelings that might or might not be going on. So we're going to spend some time looking at maybe the relationship of some of those internal events that are going on. But all through this, we want to make sure we're being honest with our assumptions about what does that actually mean that this child is acting that particular way. I want to describe some other considerations, some other issues that you might consider before we jump to this is just bad behavior and we need to fix this bad behavior. It is possible, especially for students with communication difficulties, that they may have some type of a physiological issue that's going on. And if you imagine a child who has fairly limited communication skills, they may not have any way to let you know other than to act out. One of the students that I worked with at the New England Center for Children, we could predict ear infection with 100% accuracy. And the way we did that was it started out with just recognizing that he's acting a little weird today. I'm not really sure what's going on. And we started investigating, we started trying to explore some of these issues, and eventually realized that now he's got an ear infection. And so over time what we started to recognize was there was this very predictable pattern. His behavior would change. It was nonverbal. He couldn't tell us that he hurt, that he was in pain, but he could tell us that he hurt or he was in pain, not with words, but with his actions. I think if you think about a young child, even just a pre-verbal child with or without a disability, a parent oftentimes can recognize patterns. That cry means hungry. That cry means bored. That cry means, something else, tired. And we start to recognize those patterns of crying even as subtle communication about an issue. And so I think that one of the cautions, again, before we jump in with punishers and trying to decrease or change behavior, is trying to understand that issue around physiological kinds of things. I worked with a parent who had a child with having some difficulties around bedtime and not wanting to go to bed. Pretty classic kind of example that this is a child who put the child in the crib. She would cry, parent would come in, comfort, leave, she would cry, put the child back down, comfort, cry, and this would go on. And as parents, sleep is such a precious thing that they were concerned. They wanted to know, what could we actually do to change this? And so we talked through, here's some strategies to change that behavior. But I remember saying, one other thing to think through is making sure that you take your child to the doctor and find out whether there's something else going on that might explain why this child is crying so much. And this was a close family friend, and some number of years later was contacted and found out that they had finally discovered that their daughter had some kidney problems. And so as soon as they took care of some of those issues, the, quote, behavior problems went away. There's the caution. When a child is ill, when they're uncomfortable, maybe even simply the environment's too cold or too warm, when they're in pain, when they're exhausted or fatigued, what are some of the things that might help us to understand or interpret differently those things that we would consider or potentially consider to be problematic. Some children may have no other way of letting you know that there's something wrong other than to act out in a way that we misinterpret as willful disobedience. So physiological issues are one consideration that you might look at prior to considering this a behavior problem. There's a second issue that overlaps or is related to this, and that's communication. So many of the ways that I think about working with students who are functionally nonverbal, who can't talk to communicate wants and needs, is to recognize or acknowledge that behavior, again meaning acting out behavior, is a form of communication. There's some really good research looking at pre-verbal children. Some of you may be familiar with the very popular baby sign language that's out there now. And there's actually been a good line of research investigating the use of sign language with pre-verbal children. And what's fascinating or interesting is that kids are capable of communicating wants and needs prior to their physiological ability to communicate wants or needs. So they know what they want, they know what they don't want, but they don't yet control, because of maturation or development, they don't yet control the fine motors that are required to articulate spoken language. And so some research was done looking at what happens if we teach these children a form of sign language to get some of their basic needs and wants met. And what was fascinating is they found that when they teach this sign language to pre-verbal children, the levels of the terrible two behaviors dropped dramatically. And what's even more fascinating is that by second grade, these students had IQs 1 standard deviation higher than normal or average. So technically, that's not even supposed to be possible. That intrinsic, inherent intelligence is supposed to be something that you can't change. And here, by giving children early language or communication skills, we're able to expand their understanding of their world and their ability to communicate about that world, and it results in improvements in their ability to respond to academic situations. So here's the parallel. A lot of students who are functionally nonverbal, who have some communication difficulties, may not be able to control the complex task of telling you what it is that they want or don't want, but they can tell you what they want or don't want by controlling the gross motors, the big muscles that they do have some control over. So imagine that you're a parent presenting a child with a meal and they pick up the plate of food and throw it across the room. That's communication. Yes, it is a problem behavior, but if we look at it as just something that we're supposed to, quote, get rid of, then we miss an important piece of information about what that behavior actually might mean. So the question I might encourage you to ask when you see a child doing something that you don't want them to do, ask yourself the question, is this child trying to tell me something? Is there something they're trying to say because they can't say it with words? What is it that they're trying to convey? What is it that they want? What is it that they don't want? It's not necessarily a problem behavior. It may be an effort to communicate with you. And that also gives us some hints or clues about what to do. If the issue is that the child's trying to get a want or a need met, then rather than just squash that behavior out because it's something we don't want you to do, consider what we might teach the child to do instead of, so that they can convey or communicate their wants and needs more clearly in a more understandable way. And that leads in a whole other set of directions rather than simply being punitive or getting rid of a problem. The only way we can understand that communication is to look at the context or the environment that that child is currently in. So context means what's going on right now. I just put the plate of food down. The child picked it up and threw it. What happened next? That immediate environment helps us to make a guess, and it really is a guess. Sometimes there's this sort of a guess and check option that we're in, where what we're trying to do is understand by making some connections between what was going on, what did I do, how did I react, what seems to have set this off, and then we check it. We check it by maybe trying to teach an alternative, teach the child to do something instead of that particular problem behavior that we're concerned about. I had a student that I worked with at the New England Center for Children who, when given an academic demand, so I asked the child to do something academically, he would start biting his shirt, getting frustrated, and then banging his head on the table. And we spent some time trying to understand the context for that behavior, tried to look at, well, what was going on. And we really believed, this again was a student who was nonverbal, we really believed that the student was trying to tell us that he didn't want to do that academic task, that it was hard or was frustrating. What we did instead then, instead of simply just trying to punish or teach the child not to act that way, was ask the question, what would be better, what would be a better strategy for communicating that want or need, I need to take a break from this situation, rather than biting my shirt and banging my head on the table. And we actually ended up giving him a small card that said, "Leave me alone." And we would put it on his desk, and then as we would present him with academic demands, if he would get frustrated and start biting his shirt, we would actually prompt him to hand over that "Leave me alone" card. Now, he couldn't read, he didn't know what it said, but he learned very quickly what it meant. He learned that rather than bang my head on the table, I can actually hand this card over, and the adults will recognize or understand what it is that I'm trying to tell them. And we would give him a break. The banging of head decreased, and then we were able to ask some other questions like, what is it about this demand that's so frustrating that this student would be willing to bang their head in order to get out of that? So there's a context or an example of how context helps us to guess or interpret whether this is, quote, problem behavior that's really a form of communication where we can teach them to do something else. For some kids, the communication might be a little bit different, so maybe they're trying to communicate that they want you to pay attention to them. I know this is true with most children. Many children like the attention or the interactions and the relationships that they have with adults. And I can recall from the life of my own children that there were times where I would be busy doing my own adult responsibilities in the home, and one of my children would be playing nicely. They'd be doing what they're supposed to do. So I would withdraw in order to get one of my to-do list tasks done. And I found that there were times where I'd let them be until there was some kind of, sibling rivalry, yelling, screaming stuff going on, fighting over a toy, problem behavior, and then I would rush in. And there are times where it may be that some of that fighting might be about getting an adult to come in and interact. Sometimes even things that we might consider as negative attention can be experienced by a child as I need some kind of input from the adults or people in my environment. So if I act this way, I can reliably get the adults to come back into my environment. So communication is another issue to consider as you start thinking about, is this, again, willful disobedience, or is it something else here? And my hope is that you're starting to see the ways in which our approach or our interventions might be very, very different depending upon the assumptions we bring to a situation, whether it's some type of a physiological issue or whether it's some kind of a communication issue. A third issue that you might consider is the role that environment plays. And this is, again, related to what I've just described. The goal here is to look for patterns. The goal is to try and understand, looking for subtleties, looking for, is there a particular time of day that this is more likely? Are we doing this a little bit different than we typically do it? And it can be, I have found, especially for students with more significant disabilities, sometimes to you or I, this might seem like a really small thing. It's a different brand of macaroni and cheese, and that seems like no big deal to you, but it may be the kind of change that's just different enough to create confusion or frustration or lead to some other kind of problem. So our goal here is to look for what are the patterns, what are the common things that we see that allow us to predict what's going on. And sometimes it may be that things have been going along relatively well, we haven't been having any difficulty, and then the child's behavior change. I start to see this behavior I've never seen before. So I would encourage you at that point to ask, is there something in the environment that's changed? Is there something that's different from whatever normal or expected routines look like? And I'll give you some examples. Sometimes it's different expectations. This can be true even across parents in the same household, where we interact in slightly different ways, subtle ways, that kids pick up on, and it changes their behavior. Sometimes it's differences in people. When kids work with multiple adults in a school setting, it's really important to consider the ways in which we interact or respond differently to them. So sometimes the issue is one of having different adults who make demands or directions or requests in a different way. Sometimes it's about really, really small changes like voice tone or voice pitch or voice volume or other things that seem insignificant, unimportant, but can make a difference in terms of how a child reacts. Sometimes, and this is especially true for students who might have visual or hearing impairments, sometimes other senses are key or crucial for how they react or respond. So, if you're an adult who's working with a particular child and you decide that you like this new perfume better, and so you make that change can lead to reactions from the child in which they don't recognize you anymore as being that same person. Seemingly small difference, small to you, but might make a difference in terms of how that particular child reacts. The other consideration related to this is just looking in general at the environment and whether the environment is set up for students to be able to successfully access. So here are issues around lighting, noise and distraction, or other kinds of things that might interfere with the child's ability to focus and attend to what's important or what they need to do. And here, this is also sort of a guess and check approach where we may learn some things about what works best. We may learn that when you present something in a particular setting, the way that setting is organized makes a difference in whether the child is successful or whether they're not. So there's a variety of those types of environmental issues as well. And the theme here for this training is the same. It's how do we consider what are perhaps some of the simple adjustments that can be made before we jump right into considering punishment. Now let me say here as well that I think punishment or some kind of negative consequence may have its place. There may be some times where we have to have a clear consequence for when a child breaks a rule, but I also believe it's important that we rule out some other potentially much, much simpler explanations and adjustments prior to considering that punishment piece. In this same category, this notion of environment, there may be another issue, and this is related to our awareness or understanding of any particular condition or syndrome, and the disabilities that you might have or see that there might be some slight differences in how you would approach a particular issue or problem. So it might give you a different lens or a different filter to know or understand that there might be a condition, and the characteristics of that condition could be responsible for some of the way that a child is acting. And again, having that filter of, is this really just acting out behavior, or is this a result of some particular condition or syndrome? I see a question here, so let me read this off and then I'll try and answer. The question says, Flint, how long do you wait once you make adjustments, and what others don't make, and what if others don't make those same adjustments? Very good question. A couple general guidelines. If you're going to make major change, then you want to make sure there's sufficient amount of time for a child to understand that this is now the way things work. So if I'm going to teach a new routine or I'm going to teach a new communication response, I want to make sure that there's enough time for the child to understand that the old normal is not normal anymore, the new normal is the way things really work. As a general rule, and this is a very, very general rule, if we're making changes to the environment for the purpose of changing behavior, for most kids we should be able to see at least some indication whether it's working or not working within a couple of weeks of making that change. The second half of the question, though, is critical. If we want to see change in behavior, it's really important that all of the adults who are working with that child are consistent and on the same page. If there's inconsistency, if one adult or some adults respond differently, then that can make it more difficult for the child to understand, wait, the rules have changed, it's a different environment or it's a different routine. It creates confusion, and it makes it harder for a child to recognize and respond to the adjustments that you've made. There's another way of thinking through this question, how long before you make any kind of decisions about whether this was a good idea or a bad idea. I think it's important before you make any kind of adjustment to have a clear picture in your own mind about what success would actually look like. I think we often will have a very vague sense of what we're trying to accomplish. I want the behavior to be better. I want the child to stop doing that. And the difficulty with having really kind of global or vague goals like that is it makes it challenging to recognize whether your adjustments have actually made a difference or not. So I like to think about this in sort of a metaphor or analogy about a road trip. We've probably all been on road trips where you get in the car and you're driving somewhere. That somewhere you're headed, that destination, needs to be clear in your mind if the road trip's going to succeed. You got to know where you're going in order to recognize that you got there. And I think the parallel is true here as well. If I don't know exactly what it is that I'm trying to accomplish, it's difficult to be honest with ourselves about whether it's working or not, and whether we should keep doing it or whether we should change it. So start with the end goal in mind, have that clear picture about what success would look like, and then allow the student's reaction to the changes that you've made help you to determine whether you've made the right adjustments or the wrong adjustments. Now, as I say that, I'm also thinking it's important to be realistic about the pace of change. Even when I say within a couple weeks you should be able to recognize some changes, that doesn't mean we're going to take a behavior that's happening at very, very high rates and bring it down to zero within those 2 weeks. But I should be able to see that there's some change, that it actually is having an impact toward that destination where we're headed. And if we don't, we take a step back and we might even revisit some of the issues or considerations that we've already talked about and described. It might be the case that you go back to the drawing board and you say, well, what did we miss? This should have worked. If in fact the child was trying to communicate in this way, this should have worked. Why didn't it work? What did we miss? What are the other things that we might consider as we start making those adjustments? And I've said it a couple times now, but this really is sort of a guess and check model where I have my assumptions, I make some decisions about what we're going to do differently, and then I check it out. The good news about problem behaviors is that if you get it wrong the first time, the child will likely give you another chance to get it right tomorrow. So in other words, the child will probably continue to misbehave or display that behavior that you're concerned about if we don't get the right mix of strategies in place. So we just take a step back and say, we're lost, we're off the road, we're clearly not on track for arriving at the destination that we set. Let's make an adjustment here, and then let's check and see whether that particular adjustment makes a difference. So I would say, my general answer to how do we respond, how do we make decisions about how much time is enough time before we move on to something else. So the environmental issues are important to consider. There's another issue here as well, and that is a relationship issue. Sometimes it's difficult to interpret whether a student is misbehaving or whether it's in reaction to their uncertainty about the people that are around them. And that uncertainty could take a number of different forms. So as any child moves into a public school setting, there's a period of getting used to, what is this teacher like? How does this teacher react to me? Is this a safe place? Does this adult care about me? And so having that relationship, that relatedness with people is an issue to consider, especially if there's some new change or a new person in the environment and suddenly we're seeing behaviors that we haven't seen before. It's also true that conflict in a relationship can lead to acting out behaviors. And if we're being honest, this is not just true of children with disabilities, but this is true of people in our lives, that when that relationship has some kind of conflict, it may lead to behaviors that are potentially problematic. That's pretty normal. This can actually show up in some subtle ways, though, as well. The very first student that I worked with at the New England Center for Children was my case student, and we had a staff of about 17 adults who worked with kids across the 24/7 routines that we had at the school. And we had 2 adults in particular who were having all sorts of problem behaviors with this particular child. And so we started going through this guess and check model, went in and observed, and they were running all of the instructional programs and all of the behavior management programs in the same way as every other teacher, trying to rule out some of the obvious questions. Is this a child who the teachers are, acting a little bit different, and so he's reacting? And he would literally scream these blood-curdling screams whenever one of these 2 adults would just simply walk into the room with him. They were feeling kind of bad about themselves. They didn't know what to do. They didn't understand what they were doing different. And as we looked, we couldn't find any really obvious things that they were doing different. So then we started asking more subtle questions, start to look at, well, what else might be different? Are there other factors here that we haven't considered? And then it dawned on me, because I had been the teacher who had made some of the parent contacts, that there was a similarity between the voice tone of these 2 women and the voice tone of mom. Both of these individuals smoked, so they had a lower, huskier voice tone or quality, and that became a piece that we started to investigate. Now, I don't know what about that relationship with mom may have resulted in screaming, and I'm not trying to blame mom, but what I wanted to model here is that as we started to look at this, we made some guesses that maybe it's that voice tone that reminds this child of some kind of relationship with mom. So we asked the 2 teachers if they could modulate their voice pitch up and talk with him in a higher voice tone, and the screaming stopped. So here again, sometimes the issues may be subtle, they may be confusing, but they may have some basis in a relationship issue as well. So I see another question here, I think. The question says, do you have some suggestions when trying to get another adult to look at the behavior as communication instead of naughty behavior? I get it, but a staff member I work with doesn't. Recommend this webinar. Any other ideas? I think that the communication among adults is important in terms of working with kids in general. So the way that I will often frame this as an example is to bring up a parenting issue. Very common problem behavior. Child asks mom, "Mom, can I go spend time wherever?" Mom says, "No, you cannot." Child does what next? Ask dad. Why? I might get a different answer. So in fairness, I could flip this around. Child asks dad. Dad says no. I go to ask mom next. I might get a different answer. If mom and dad are not on the same page about expectations and consequences, if there isn't consistency, then kids will eat you for lunch. They will find and exploit the weaknesses between you. They'll pit one adult against the other. They'll look for the limits and they'll test those limits. And so I think what I would say, or what I would encourage, is rowing out to meet that kind of disagreement about or misunderstanding about communication and the importance of being consistent. I would encourage and do encourage all adults who are involved with a particular child of the critical importance of being on the same page. We know this is true in parenting, that parents who are a united front are more effective in working with their child. We also know that this is true in school settings, that when all of the adults are consistent in their reaction to a child, you get better outcomes from that child by doing that. I sometimes would even put it this way: when we make decisions about how we collectively are going to interact with a child, I think it's important that we do all of the what-if scenarios and we talk through all of the issues of resistance and all of the potential interpretations on the front end, so that we make a plan about how we collectively are going to act. And as I work with school teams, I will sometimes say, literally, this is sort of like speak now or forever hold your peace. Because on Monday when we start running this change, it's absolutely essential that every single adult who's involved is being as consistent as possible in terms of the ways that we react or interact. Now I want to come back and hook this up with the last question, though, because I think sometimes the resistance to do the same thing may be because we disagree about what we think should be done, and that's okay. Here's where that destination or that definition of success becomes important again. If we're committed to saying this is what success would look like, then we can all recognize whether it's working or it's not working. And I have seen, just in terms of the disagreement among adults about what to do with a child, sometimes those disagreements can be mediated by recognizing or acknowledging that if this is a bad idea, if we try this out collectively together and it fails to result in success, then we have a responsibility to change it. So maybe you're right. Maybe we should try it your way next. We have to make some decisions, though, about what we're going to do so that we can all be on the same page, so that the child experiences that consistency, which leads to better outcomes or more quick kinds of changes in behavior than if there's that inconsistency. Really important that we get on that same page in that way. And then the second thing I sometimes say, as we're at that point of implementation, is when it's Monday morning, and we've all agreed that this is what we're going to do, it's really important that there are no exceptions and there are no excuses. We want to make sure that the environment is predictable. We want to make sure that if we've made a change, that we're responding and reacting in a very predictable way, so that this new normal, whatever that means, this new way of being or doing, is more clear to the student. It's easier for them to pick up on the pattern and the way that that pattern has changed for them as well. Coming back to this relationship issue, one more point I'd like to make. Young or new relationships also may lead the child to act differently. It's that unfamiliarity. This is sort of like the substitute teacher syndrome. One of the reasons why substitute teachers have such a difficult time in general with student behavior is because of their unfamiliarity. And this has implications to some of the other things that we've already talked about. When a substitute teacher asks the question, okay, what are we supposed to do next? It's like blood in the water. Kids that understand this is an adult who doesn't know what's expected. They don't know what normal is. And it opens up that possibility of acting out. There is the same kind of thing that happens whenever there's a staff change or a grade change or new adults enter into the child's life because of somebody who's hired or things of that sort. And what I would encourage you to recognize is that it wouldn't be unusual to see behaviors that we consider challenging when some of those kind of life changes happen. This is related to human nature. None of us like change. Very few of us enjoy having our routines flipped upside down on us. I sometimes tease teachers about how routine-driven we are and how important that predictability is to us. I ask them the question usually in trainings, what happens, how do you feel if you come to school and somebody's parking in your parking spot? How does that change your behavior? And I think they were joking, but I've had some teachers who say, I feel like I want to key the car of that person who's in my spot. And I think most of us have enough self-control to avoid trying to do that. But what it often does is it leads us to change our behavior as well. I'm going to get there just a little bit earlier tomorrow to make sure that I get my spot. The parallel here is that any type of new or change, whether it's a change in relationship or persons, whether it's a change in routine, very likely will lead to some bumpy spots. It'll very likely lead to some of the kinds of behaviors that we would describe as acting out. That's pretty normal. If we can anticipate that, if we can understand that because this is a new person or because this is a new routine, and because we expect that there may need to be some lead-in time that getting used to the change will help us to avoid jumping right to the conclusion that this is a problem behavior that we need to fix or we need to punish. So communication issues, physiological issues, environmental issues, relationship issues, all important considerations in terms of what should we do as we see these challenging behaviors happen. I think there is an absolutes level here as well, though. I think it's important to recognize that there are some behaviors that we do need to treat as problem behaviors. And I would say that my filter would be when a behavior is a danger to self, others, or property, then we have to do something about those behaviors. We have to treat those as behaviors that we need to reduce, that we need to find ways to get rid of or to manage. And really danger is the key here because we can't simply ignore them. Their severity or intensity is too great to simply just say, well, let's try and figure out what's going on and what some of the issues are. So at that point, I think that we do have to develop some type of a plan for how do we react in ways that we're keeping people safe. For self-injurious behavior, it may be about trying to make sure that there's a reduced injury risk. For aggression, it's about reducing the risk of injury to others. And for some of those environmental destruction kinds of issues or danger to property, we want to make sure that we're looking at what do we do to prevent those kinds of risks from happening. I have another question here, so let's see. What about families handling the behavior differently than school, even after discussion? Do we still need to still go ahead at the school with the change in the plan? And I would say yes. Ideally, back to that parenting example, getting mom and dad on the same page is important. It's important to try to get family, parents on the same page as school. To the extent that we can arrive at that agreement of doing the same thing together, it improves the outcomes for students. However, if in either direction, if parents are doing something that school is unwilling to do, or if school is doing something that parents are unwilling to do, we can still see benefit and change or improvement in behavior independent of the fact that we can't get all of the stakeholders and players on the same page. I'll give you another example. I see this in school settings all the time as well. You have a student who is model citizen in one classroom and can walk out the doorway, 5 steps down the hallway, cross into a different threshold in a different room, and suddenly flip the nasty switch and having all of these acting out behaviors. And then we end up with people saying, well, the disability makes them act that way. And I would argue that that's probably not the best explanation or understanding of why a child would act that way. The reality is that maybe there's something different within those environments that's leading to different problems. So the parallel here is that children can learn that the rules, the expectations, the way in which people react to me is different in this environment than it is in a different environment. I've seen parallels as well in families where there's been a divorce and child spends some time with one parent and spends time with a second parent where the expectations and the consequences are not the same. Now, I'll be honest, it's not ideal. It's not ideal in a school situation where school and home are doing different things. It's not ideal in a parenting situation where parents are doing different things. It makes it harder to get those changes. However, it's not impossible. It is quite possible for students to learn that the rules here at school are different than the rules at home. The way I react at school or the way I communicate wants and needs at school is different than the way I communicate at home. So big picture, having all of the stakeholders on the same page is highly desirable because of the benefits of having everybody on the same page. But it's not a death sentence. It doesn't mean that we can't accomplish good things when some of the adults are not following through or are not invested in acting or reacting in the same way to those kinds of behaviors. So, absolutes. There are some behaviors that we need to react or respond to. There are some things that we have to treat as danger to self, others, and property and address from a safety standpoint. Let me be clear about one other issue here. When we treat behaviors as a safety issue, when we respond, the goal, the success in these cases is keeping everybody safe. So that's very different than changing those behaviors. That's a secondary issue. The first goal is safety. The first goal is making sure that this situation is managed in a way that reduces the risks involved with those very, very dangerous behaviors. But don't expect those interventions that we use to keep people safe, don't expect those interventions to actually change the behavior. That's a totally separate issue. So first focus on safety, and then second, we revisit those same sets of assumptions that we've been talking about. I start looking at what's the pattern here. Is it happening at certain times of day? Is it happening in certain situations? Is there something in the environment that's subtle that we need to investigate? Is this a communication issue? Is there something physiologically going on that helps us to understand or explain? And that's the piece, that patterning, that leads us to say, all right, let's focus now on what we can do to actually change the course of this behavior, to actually get the change or reduction in those behaviors. Secondary to the issue of safety, I think it's still important to acknowledge that there are going to be times when we need to address this behavior from that perspective of what do we do to keep everybody involved safe in this situation, and then we can create some other responses to the underlying issues for that particular behavior concern. One more way to think about this as we're sort of rounding the corner here, I have a summary big idea piece, but I want to talk about what now. So we've got some guesses. We think perhaps this is a communication issue. We make some adjustments. We try it out. We see whether we're arriving at what we've defined as success or not. Maybe we aren't, but we're getting there. So we make some more adjustments and we try again. That process may take some time until we zero in on the right package of changes in the environment to make the situation better. There's one other piece here that I want you to think about or consider. There are times when, in fact, the interventions should be behavioral. The interventions should be focused on, this is a kid who knows what they're supposed to do. They're capable of doing it because I've seen them do it, but they're not doing it. That would be a real problem behavior and something that we would want to try and focus on from a behavior intervention standpoint. Again, I want you to understand that I'm saving that till last because I think it's important that we rule out some of the other explanations first. Otherwise, we might end up with the wrong tool for the job. But there are occasions where we need to treat this as a problem behavior that needs to be reduced. And in that situation, there are some common things that we want to think about. I take what I would call an instructional approach to behavior management. So here's how this looks. Every time you see a child misbehaving, doing something they're not supposed to do, the important question to ask is this: what do I want this child to do instead of that problem behavior? Here's how this is important. So the question is, child is misbehaving, what do I want this child to do instead of that acting out behavior? How this is important is that if we're only focused on getting rid of a behavior, there are very few tools that we have to achieve that goal or job. And most of those tools are going to be punishment focused. We're going to punish that behavior out. We're going to squash it out. We're going to teach the child not to ever act that way again. I want to come back to something that I said at the very, very beginning. Problem behavior is not a problem for the students who display it. It's a functional skill. It's something that they have practiced, perfected, and honed, and are pulling out just at the right moment because it works for them. And if we think about problem behavior as a functional skill, and if you come back to the question that I just described, it leads us in a very different direction than simply getting tough or punishing a child's behavior. If I see a child misbehaving, even if it's willfully misbehaving, they're doing this on purpose, they know they're not supposed to, they're breaking the rule. If all we do is punish that behavior, we actually can get rid of it. There are really, really strong punitive consequences that get rid of behavior. Now, I say this half jokingly, so understand, electric shock does work. In Washington State, it's illegal. We can't do that to kids. But, and we believe for ethical reasons that we shouldn't do that. But when we experience strong, unpleasant consequences, we tend not to do those behaviors again. There's actually research in the 1970s looking at the use of contingent electric shock for problem behaviors, and it won't surprise anyone that when you shock a student or a child or an individual following a behavior, they tend not to do that behavior again in the future. The natural example that many of us have experienced is people who have in their past stuck a finger or a piece of metal in an electrical outlet. That electric shock usually results in people only doing that once. So punishment works. But again, if I don't recognize or acknowledge that kids who act out are acting out for reasons, that I can squash that behavior out, but if I don't give kids something else to do instead of that problem behavior, they will very likely pick a new behavior, and you likely won't like that new behavior any better than the one that you just got rid of. So come back to the question. A child is acting out. This is a problem behavior. My question is, what do I want the child to do instead of that problem behavior? And here's where this leads us to different interventions. When I've identified something I want the child to do instead of the problem behavior, now I have something to teach them how to do. So if a child has a need or a want, they're trying to communicate something with me, instead of simply punishing that acting out behavior, what do I want to teach them to do instead of that would allow them to get their needs met? And in all honesty, whether we're talking about kids with significant disabilities or kids in general ed settings or kids in the home, I think there is more power in taking this approach than almost anything else. Yes, that's a problem behavior. Yes, we want to see that happening less often. So let's give the child something to do instead of that problem behavior, rather than simply trying to squash it out and get rid of it. I want to see if there are any other questions that people have. And if not, lots to think about. So I think I'll move forward here to the summary, and if another question pops in, then I'll try and answer that as well. Oh, here's one. When would you try to teach the child the new behavior instead of the bad behavior? Right after they do the bad behavior? I would actually say right before they do the bad behavior. So here's where context is important. I'll take you back to one example that I used already. We had a student who we believed was acting out, biting shirt and banging head in the context of academic demands. So before the shirt biting, in that context that triggers or sets off the shirt biting and head banging, that would be the context that you would set up opportunities for the child to learn that instead of, you don't have to bang your head, and we would redirect that behavior into this other direction. I also think this is why understanding a pattern or that context or that environment is important. I need to know the situations in which a child typically acts that way, and then I'm going to change my reaction, or I'm going to change something in the environment to help them to learn, instead of acting out, here's something that you could do instead of that particular challenge or problem behavior. And I almost think about it in the same way you do with any other academic learning. We're going to do a lesson, in effect, but the lesson is in the real world or in the real context, in the situation where that child's having problems. It's better to teach in those real situations for a lot of reasons, one of which is generalization. Kids are more likely to learn and use those new skills if they're being taught in the settings and in the context and in the situation that's the real situation of greatest concern. We use the same instructional methods, though, that we would use for an academic skill. So if I'm trying to teach a child a different social behavior in a situation, then I'm going to have to use some prompts, and I'm going to have to fade those prompts over time. I'm going to have to give the student feedback, both correction when they start down the misbehavior path, and then really important, I want to make sure that I'm giving them positive feedback when they're making good choices and they're doing the things that we want them to do. I think I saw another question here. It had to do with dangerous situations. And now I'm not finding it. Says, thinking of a student you have worked with, could you once again go through how you worked with teams in those 4 areas? And 4 areas being around the physiological issues, the communication issues. So, yes, how do I work with teams? I think that one of the things I will say on the front end is working with teams is preferable. It's preferable to working with teams rather than working with individuals, in part because of some of the earlier questions. If I have all of the stakeholders sitting around the same table, any of the issues of resistance or any of the issues or concerns that those adults might have can be brought to the fore. And I mentioned this statement, speak now or forever hold your peace. I literally speak those words in part because I want people to understand that now is the time to disagree. Now is the time to express concerns about anything that's suggested or recommended. So trying to create a space where people can really put the real issues, the thorny stuff, out on the center of the table that we can actually talk through and talk about. And then I think there's a process of being able to investigate, to ask questions. So tell me about what you know. Tell me about what you see. Sometimes it involves me going and watching. And again, the filter that I use is looking for patterns. So I'm watching to see in those situations, are there certain things that set kids off? Are there certain things that seem to happen reliably when adults react to those problem behaviors? And together, collectively as a team, we're trying to look for, understand, name those issues. So I might ask questions about physiological issues. What do we know? What have we learned? I might ask the stakeholders about what have they tried? What have they seen? What has worked? Does the behavior happen all the time, or does it only happen sometimes? And when people say, well, it only happens sometimes, then I might dive deeper and say, what can you tell me is different about the times when the behavior happens versus the times when it doesn't? And again, the idea is, can we pick out a pattern here? And the pattern is really a guess. It's just our best guess or understanding of what might be going on. I ask questions about what do we know about the child in terms of their disability, in terms of the characteristics of that disability. That might be important. In terms of communication, I would say in particular for students who are nonverbal, functionally nonverbal, communication is one of the single most important areas of need. So when I look at individualized education programs for that group of students, I would hope that communication is a number 1 or a number 2 area of domain need. It's that priority level because it's so interconnected with everything else. And when I work with a child that has very limited communication skills, I'm immediately thinking communication and behavior integrated together. What's the relationship between some of the acting out behaviors that a team might be concerned about and that child's lack of ability to be able to respond to their needs? Maybe those acting out behaviors are in fact their best attempt at trying to tell the world what it is that they need to tell the world. I think that also in working with teams, we make our guesses. So we pull together the information that we have, and then we fit it into that pattern. This is our best understanding, acknowledging that we could be wrong about our understanding, but that's okay, because if we're wrong, then the student will give us another chance to get it right. We're going to be able to look at, was success achieved? Did we change the behavior in the way that we desired or not? And if we did not, then we're pulling the team back together and we're sitting down again and taking a second go. What did we miss? If this should have worked, why didn't it work? If it didn't work, what else could we try? How could we improve upon what things may be working a little bit? It's a little bit better, but it's not where we want it to be, and so what's the next step that we need to take? And again, I think that team-based process is critical to be able to make those adjustments over time and gradually zero in on what's the issue. I think that sometimes we make this very high stakes. We got to get it right. Well, sometimes we don't get it right. Sometimes our first effort fails, and that's okay if we've learned something from that failure. If we've learned why, perhaps, or that narrows us down to saying, well, maybe our assumptions were in fact wrong. And if those assumptions were wrong, what else would help us to understand or explain this behavior that leads us to take that next step? It may in fact be the case that we don't get it right the first time, and having some way of knowing are we arriving at that destination allows us to make those adjustments over time, and then direct our energies in another direction to continue to try and move that progress forward for that particular child. Any other questions? Let me move forward here and summarize then. I think the big ideas I'd like you to take away are about test your assumptions. It's about recognizing that if this were easy, if it were clear and transparent, we wouldn't be sitting here today and having this conversation. So sometimes we come to a problem or a situation with our own set of ideas about the reasons why a child is acting a particular way. It's okay to shelve those and to look at what are the other potential reasons, alternative explanations for the reason why a child's acting a particular way, and then test those assumptions out. There is a point at which maybe we consider it a problem behavior and then we treat it accordingly after we've assessed other contributing factors and issues. But some of those contributing factors and issues may be much simpler than developing a complex behavior plan. So rule out the easy things first. And when we've ruled out some of those easy things, then perhaps it's time to take that next step of saying, what else might we consider here? What's the next layer that we need to drop down to in order to understand and potentially adjust or change those acting out behaviors that we're most concerned about? If there are no additional questions, I'll turn it back over to Kathy.
Great. Thanks so much, Flint. I sure wish I had had you sitting in my pocket all those years of child raising for myself. Because I think sometimes I made behavior a whole lot harder than it had to be because I didn't consider some of those first four things you talked about, the physiological, the relationship, the communication, and the environment. It gives me a chance, as someone who also provides consultation to teams, a very quick way for us to look at those pieces that you said, rule the easy pieces out first. And I know that the safety piece, and you just barely talked about that part, is an area that we probably would really like to have you back to talk about, because there are some students we work with who there is a danger safety issue that you have to deal with, and at the same time then consider the other four and see what you can do with those. So with that, once again, thanks so much, Flint, for making it clear and easy to understand. I should say simple, not always easy, but simple. Because all of us come with that filter of our own idea of what, quote, acceptable behavior is. And having worked with such a variety of families and school districts, I sometimes realize that my set of values may not be the same set of values that someone else has. And it's not bad or good, it's just different. And my trying to understand the values that other people hold as they're dealing with the child's behavior is also very important for me. So again, thanks so much. We appreciate it. And with that, we'll go ahead and say goodbye to all of you, and hope this was helpful and useful to you.